I'm Bill Rosenberg, and I'm from the New Zealand Council of Trade Unions, and I'll be facilitating this session on rights and protections, which looks at things largely from a rights point of view. We have 4 speakers who I will introduce as we go along, but they come from a broad set of backgrounds, and I think got some very interesting contributions to make. So, given that we don't have as much time as the lucky knowledge people, I'll get straight into it. Now we'll start with consumers, and we've got Richard Aston, who's chairperson of Consumer New Zealand and an entrepreneur in his own right, working in the area of not-for-profits. I think that's right, isn't it? Richard, we're often told that these agreements are good for consumers because they provide choice and cheaper goods, and there's some truth in that. But consumers also have rights to ensure that what they're buying is safe and of good quality and does what it says it does. And with cross-border services such as health and finance, it becomes even more difficult to ensure consumers and patients and clients are protected. The use of their personal information and privacy is an increasing issue, which becomes more difficult if the buyer and seller are separated by thousands of kilometres. So how do you see this developing, and what should be in these agreements to ensure that, as far as possible, consumers have at least as good protection when shopping internationally as at home?
That's a big question. So I come from a consumer perspective, which is quite selfish, is what's the benefit for consumers outside of the export side of agreements. And Consumer New Zealand, we work very closely, particularly with our European counterparts. There's large umbrella organisations in the European Union that we've been talking to, and particularly working on a potential Euro-New Zealand trade deal. So that's, we work together. Trade, I mean, basically we're for it. We think free trade can be of benefit to consumers, and some of the European research shows that's true. There's significant benefits. And I was reading from one of those Euro reports an interesting part of human history around trade. They did these studies, they've done studies on Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. Now, Neanderthals never traded. They didn't trade outside the little local areas at all. Homo sapiens did. You can see their tools are all over the place. And the conclusion is that that's how we survived as a species. We traded a lot. So it's in the human story, it's even in our DNA to trade. But there's a fine line between trading and invading. We've also done a lot of invading in human history, and I think big trade deals have an invasion quality to them as well. So benefits to consumers, if you're dropping tariffs and trade restrictions, it obviously comes through as better prices, a wide range of goods and quality for consumers. That's good, if that actually happens, if the traders pass that benefit on to consumers. So we think that trade agreements should have consumers' interests in the centre of them. They're always on the fringe of the negotiations usually. And a whole chapter on consumer protection, consumer benefits. And higher than that, the intent of the trade agreement should be around what is best for people, consumers, people. And the traders, we'll let them make a few bob on the side, but it should be about what's best for people in each sovereign country. So that's our main position. We're pretty hot at the moment on country of origin labelling, which we think could be included in trade agreements. How we regulate that's another issue I'll come to. And we're pretty keen on blockchain to handle that, actually, Alex. So country of origin labelling is where did this product come from, but not only that, what was the standards behind making that product, who was enslaved by making that product or not. All that information should be freely available on a transparent basis to consumers, not filtered through a bunch of regulators and governments who I do not trust. We've got an issue around consumer protection and privacy. Now, privacy is an interesting thing. We do a lot of surveys of consumers, And the concern about privacy is about 50-50, around about the 35-year-old, 40-year-old limit. Under 40, most people don't give a crap about privacy. I don't mind what Facebook, my kids tell me, I don't care what Facebook knows about me. I have no interest. So that's from a consumer perspective. If you're over 40, our older members are really concerned they know everything about me, whereas the younger people say whatever. So it's interesting that it's kind of a split in terms of consumer interest. Consumers are much more interested in protection from invasion, which is dodgy business practices on the big open global markets, and that's where it's shifting now. So we get lots of complaints to our phone line about people getting ripped off on overseas websites, not the big reputable ones, and there's no recourse, there's no way. And I don't think that having that company having an office in New Zealand makes any difference at all. There need to be really good, solid agreements about protecting consumers from this country who are buying from another country, because we are entering into a global business. Global warming is just the beginning. There's global trading is going to be everywhere. So we'd like to see better protection for consumers in terms of their trading in the digital markets. And there's other things like telecommunications. Our consumers complain a lot about roaming charges, getting whizzed by big telecommunications companies. Why can't we include that in some of the deals where you can buy overseas, you can trade overseas, or telecommunications, and regulatory stuff. Now, our European friends have done a lot of stuff on that. What tends to happen in trade agreements is a whole bunch of regulations agreed within that trade agreement between two countries, because you can have an agreement, but it's so we're going to lower the tariffs. Well, what does that mean? Who gets the benefit, the consumers or not? And that's the regulatory environment in the sovereign country and the country doing the exporting. All that stuff happens behind closed doors and by government officials who I'm cynical about. What the hell do they know about that stuff? We think that the regulatory framework could be set up, the idea in a trade agreement, but it should be outside of the trade agreement. It should be open source, ad hoc, organisational systems where regulations between two countries are a collaborative process where regulators here are talking a lot to regulators over there and agreeing or not on how to harmonise regulations. And we're talking about regulations on standards, safety standards. What do we do if somebody gets ripped off here, and what's the regulatory sort of track back on all that sort of stuff. So we think the regulatory environment should be outside the secrecy of the trading agreement and open. I could go on, but I won't.
Thanks, Richard. Food for thought there, and we'll come back to that. So our next speaker is Andrew Chen, who's a PhD candidate in the Faculty of Engineering here at the University of Auckland. Andrew's going to talk about privacy, privacy and controlling the use of our personal information for commercial purposes is increasingly at risk in the digital world, and Richard's talked a little bit about that and different people's attitudes towards it. It's changing very rapidly with the Facebooks and Googles of the world, increasingly difficult to regulate and control. Their interests are also reflected in the trade and investment agreements, particularly in e-commerce chapters, as Jane was just talking about in the previous session. How do you think this industry will develop over the next decade or so, and how would you see international agreements best structured in the face of this constant change in order to ensure people's privacy and control of their lives is protected?
Kia ora koutou. So I'm from the Faculty of Engineering and specifically a computer systems engineer, so I'm actually in front of the technology every day and developing it and feeling bad about it sometimes. And just to, from that perspective, I need to provide the balancing perspective to Dr. Sims, just to, with all due respect, stuff the blockchain. It's got a lot of good things, as she's mentioned, but there are also definitely a lot of bad things. You can't just take the good bits, you're going to have to take up all of the bad things as well alongside. So when you do your research into looking up what the blockchain is, make sure you get both sides of the story. So I'm just going to read from my notes because it's been a little bit of a hectic week and I haven't had much time to prepare. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about privacy and how we can use international trade to try and help protect our privacy rights. So a lot of the threats to privacy in the coming years are going to be enabled by advances in AI, and this is going to change the way that our data is being moved around and traded in ways that our rights were not considered when our rights were being created. Our rights are just simply not fit for purpose in this new landscape. And privacy is one of these areas where exposing the downsides of large-scale data collection and trade of that data can generate a lot of attention. So if we think about the NSA or Cambridge Analytica and Facebook, you get this huge furor after one of these things is exposed, but then most of the mitigation strategies are placed on the individual. So we tell ourselves, okay, well, delete Facebook, or don't use social media, or don't use Google. But actually, a lot of these actions, there are very few nation-state responses or actions. And so governments simply don't know what's out there right now. Lawmakers are unaware of both the risks and the opportunities that where we can use technology to help protect privacy. And this is one area where states have been largely reactionary. The current privacy bill that's currently going through Parliament, it's hoped to pass for next year, and it's been characterised as fit for 2013. So it's going to be out of date upon arrival. So that's how far back governments are. And there is a reliance on the lobbyists in this space. And these lobbyists are funded by companies who say things like, move fast and break things. And that's not really a good strategy, right? We don't trust civil engineers to build bridges in this way, yet we're building this whole new digital infrastructure in this way. And privacy rights are viewed as antithetical to capitalism by these companies because they get in the way of doing business. More companies are wary of this now, but in a sense, without that regulation, there's no incentive for companies to behave in a way that is going to protect the privacy of individuals. At the same time, Europe is exporting their privacy standards with the GDPR. So this is something that's been happening this year. Jane calls it organ harvesting. We call it contagious legislation. It's the same thing. It's this idea that states basically copy each other. They look overseas and they go, yeah, that seems to be a good idea. We'll do the same thing. And this can be good if we're doing good things, right? If we're copying good protections, then it's actually a good thing. So what happened with the GDPR is it led to a massive scramble of all of these companies around the world going, oh, we need to be GDPR compliant or otherwise we're going to lose access to the European market. And that's a huge market, so they had to make themselves compliant. And it wasn't because being GDPR compliant was impossible before. It wasn't that it was technically not possible. It was just because they didn't want to. And now that there was this need for them to do it, they became compliant. And so for that to happen, it requires leadership from states, right? So we've seen that in the EU. New Zealand can be a leader in this space and prioritise it and say that it's important to us as well. And so trade agreements can demand performance standards over how trade is conducted. So for example, there are cross-border data transfer requirements that are in a whole bunch of these e-commerce chapters in trade agreements. And it can be weird to think about data transfers as international trade, but there is that exchange of value that can be regulated in the same way that we say, okay, cars that are imported, we reserve the right to be able to look into a car. If you bring a software program into this country, then we reserve the right to have a look at that software code, potentially. And there are some existing standards, but we could go much further to introduce some stronger property rights around data. So you owning your own data and having rights to that data, you can do this with or without the blockchain. And particularly how multinationals obtain and then use and trade that data for secondary purposes. Because data is non-rivalrous. It can be copied easily. People can use it multiple times. It requires a slightly different set of rules to say your house or a vehicle or tangible property. So New Zealand, the GDPR is an example of how this can be achieved, and we can do a lot more. And I think that New Zealand can make privacy a priority, and it should be a priority for all trading nations.
Thanks very much, Andrew. And in time too. That's very good. Jeff is grimacing there. Can I introduce Jeff, who you've already met? Jeff Bertram, who's he talks a bit about himself as a retired economist. He's actually an economist who has retired and is a fellow at a research associate at the Institute for Governance and Policy Studies at Victoria University. Jeff is going to talk about corporations, rights and corporations. So the Facebooks and the Googles that we've been talking about quite a lot are just one type of multinational corporation, though currently some of the largest in the world. These corporations have been major forces behind the trade and investment agreements and are given very influential roles in their design. One of the most controversial aspects of these agreements, ISDS, is designed to protect their interests in a quite unprecedented way in historical terms that compromise sovereignty in our judicial systems. But their reach goes further than this. Many people say that these powers do not belong in these agreements. What should be the relationship between these agreements and domestic law, and what should we be aiming at?
Right, well, what I want to talk about essentially two things. One is unbundling and Trojan horses, and the second is takings. In other words, taking stuff away from people. And I want to start with unbundling because I get frustrated at the way that the discourse around these agreements calls them trade agreements, where only a minor part of the agreement is actually about trade. And all sorts of other stuff has been bundled in, and you get it on a take it or leave it basis. And I think it's really important for a progressive strategy that you unbundle, unpick, get the bits separately and deal with each of them on their merits and on their own terms. Now, we know that both local and transnational corporate interests would like to have their property rights treated as absolute and inviolable, and they'd like to have strong provisions written into the trade agreements to enable them to block the taking of their property by any national government. And this extremist assertion of corporate property rights gets wrapped up into trade negotiations is a deliberate strategy, and this has been going on since the multilateral agreement on investment ran into popular opposition in 1998 and was defeated by popular opposition. So precisely the same ideas, the same quest for corporate rights and total protection against any taking of property has now got wrapped into agreements which are being sold to you under the heading of free trade. And there are two consequences of that, it seems to me. The most important one is it discredits the idea of free trade. It means that, you know, while there are a lot of really good things about trade and free trade and exchange, the benefits of exchange, the agreements in which those benefits have now been packaged up are becoming so discredited that the good stuff is getting lost in the murk that's created around property rights and takings and the assertion of corporate interest. So I think the first step in a progressive strategy is to rescue trade from the embrace of the United States-led anti-takings jurisprudence. And I guess this is where I talk about Trojan horses. You know, the Trojan horse is a really neat device. It's a beautiful package. It looks great. You drag it in the gates because you're so proud to have it. And nobody mentions to you at the time that inside that Trojan horse are forces that will leap out and destroy the city-state in which you are living and its system of laws and its integrity. I always think it's really unfair on the poor old inhabitants of Troy that it's called a Trojan horse, because it was actually a Greek horse and they used it to break Troy open, strip it bare, you know, and destroy it. It's a Greek horse, not a Trojan horse. And rather to my regret, Monty Python never did the story of the Trojan horse. But I have a little strip that runs in my mind about this. I see this great big beautiful painted horse in front of the gates of Troy and all the alpha males who run the place saying, yes, yes, bring it in, it's just what we want. And I imagine a couple of Trojan housewives sort of having a look at this thing and saying, hey, it's got a door in the side. Do you think it's quite big? Do you think there might be something to worry about? No, say the alpha males, it's big and beautiful. Bring it on in, you know. And you could write a whole little skit around this, I think, about the wisdom of ordinary people who use common sense to say there might be something hidden in there that we might want to check out before we bring it in, all right? Maybe we can put it through the scanner like at the airport before we actually bring it in the gate. And that, I think, is the way one has to think about these agreements. Once they stop being trade agreements, and they have stopped being trade agreements, that's the packaging, and become Trojan horses containing a vast pile of corporate interest, all packaged up in this glossy package. It's really important to unpick the bits. Trade is trade, no more, no less. Needs to be dealt with as trade. Investment is something different, and it needs to be dealt with as investment. Corporate rights and duties are simply that. They are the rights and duties of a corporate entity. They're not trade, they're not investment, they are rights and duties. And because the nation remains the repository of most of the things we want to protect against the more malignant bits of the global system, like it or not, as Jane said yesterday, we need to reinsert the nation state as a key defence against the malignant bits of the global system, but it needs to be a rather reinvented state that we reinsert. If we just reinsert what we've got, we get into all the problems that people have talked about in the last couple of days. Now, having said that then, I want to talk about how you should think about rights and duties. First off, until we have a genuinely legitimate and hegemonic world government that really looks after the interests that are fundamentally important to human beings in their societies, corporate rights and duties are defined by national law, or at least have to be defined by national law. The whole point about the multilateral agreement on investment, there's quite a nice Wikipedia article about it, and I'll just read you a couple of passages from that. The multilateral agreement on investment sought to establish a new body of universal investment laws that would give corporations unconditional rights to engage in financial operations around the world without regard to national laws and citizens' rights, and gave corporations the right to sue government if national health, labour or environmental legislation threatened their interests. There it is in a nutshell. And the countervailing thing to that is to assert the primacy, for the moment, of national laws over people who want to act within the nation. So we come to takings then. And the principle that one refers back to is the principle of eminent domain. The sovereign, does have the ability to seize the property of individuals and corporations within the national realm. It just means that the rights of private property are circumscribed in any nation by the duty of national governments to act for the greater good of their peoples. That's the idealistic version. Or limited by the ability of the sovereign to go out and take from anybody within the boundaries of the territory that they control. And so that means that all property and all property rights within a sovereign nation are ultimately held and exercised subject to regulation, taxation and possible confiscation. Within the nation's borders, nobody is above the law, including foreign corporates. And here you've got to say should be rather than is, I guess. And being subject to the law of the land does mean being subject to uncompensated losses if the national government imposes such losses. And you hope that they're acting in the national interest and following due process. And transnational corporations should claim no greater protection than ordinary citizens have and should be given none. ISDS is redundant as well as offensive. Now, here we come to the conundrum. We want to think about justice in takings. There are just takings and there are unjust takings. A taking is not just a taking, it comes in different ethical flavours. And you think back in New Zealand history and think of the large number of references to the Treaty of Waitangi and the subsequent events in this country, we have had a massive exercise in uncompensated taking by white settler society from the tangata whenua, right? And we're still busy working through the consequences of that. And it's no surprise to me that among the interests that step forward to be keen on promoting the treaty settlements and to talk about the injustices committed against Maori in this country were quite a number of neoliberal thinkers on the right, the Business Roundtable and so on, who wanted to hide the protection of their rights behind the shield of sympathy for Maori confiscation. Now, there are degrees of justice, therefore. The state that does the taking may be acting, genuinely for the common good, or it may be acting for some particular sectional good. And it's really important to stand back and think philosophically about how the power of eminent domain is being utilised. And so when you are looking at a national state confronting global capital in the interests of clearing a democratic space for protecting the interests of its citizens, and let's suppose for the moment that we've solved the problem of what the interests of those citizens are, we're not at loggerheads about what it is that's to be protected. First off, you need to know, is it are the property rights that are potentially threatened by the state justly acquired? Anybody who's read Robert Nozick's Anarchy, State and Utopia, one of the favourite philosophers of the neolibs on the right, will know about the difference between justly acquired property and unjustly acquired property, and justly held property and unjustly held property. That's a really important distinction. Some property rights are acquired justly and maintained justly, some are not. And an awful lot of the rights being claimed by the international forces of corporate capital are not justly acquired and not justly held if you work from the standpoint of a national community. And so I just want to remind you of a few of the things that look like legitimate taking in the context of New Zealand government and law. You remember the Sentencing Vehicle Confiscation Amendment Act 2009, Section 7, for example. Crusher Collins. Under that section, the courts may seize and order the destruction of the cars of persistent boy racers. There is no compensation payable. It's a straight-out taking. Boom. And if you think about the interests that leapt up and down with enthusiasm about the Crusher Collins program, you realise that property rights are not inviolable. They are subject to taking after due process. Think about the Fisheries Act 1996, Section 207. Fishing vessels that are breaking the rules and regulations covering the exclusive economic zone may be seized without compensation, and the captain and crew subject to proceedings. It's an uncompensated taking. It's a completely legitimate taking. Think of a couple of others. Some of them you don't like and some of them you do like, I guess. One that I really don't like is Section 47 of the Energy Companies Act 1992, which expropriated the assets and the businesses of the old electricity supply authorities in New Zealand. Just said on a date appointed by the Governor-General by order in council made on the recommendation of the Minister, the undertaking of a board, that's an electricity supply authority, named in the order, and all the shares shall, by virtue of the section, vest in such person or persons as are specified in the order, which for that purpose shall give effect to the provisions of the establishment plan approved in respect of that board. Gobbledygook at first sight, but it just says, hey, your assets are hereby seized, they're transferred to whatever entity the Minister thinks would be a good one to take over. And lo and behold, you have the electricity network distribution companies which surround us now. Take another one. The Bank of New Zealand Act 1945, Section 3, says the government thinks it would be a good idea for us to have a bank. We hereby announce that we're taking it over. All the shareholders will get the sum of £2, 5 shillings in cash, or £2, 6 shillings and 8 pence in tax-free, non-transferable New Zealand government bonds. Full stop. The Bank of New Zealand is then a government entity, and the shareholders who previously owned the bank are given a fixed sum and if they don't opt for cash, they'll get government bonds. Now, these are takings, and they are legitimate takings after due process approved by the Parliament of the land. And whether they are just simply because due process has been pursued, of course, is an open question. And there you'd go back to the land confiscations of the 19th century, which certainly did have the approval of the Parliament, but you have to worry about the legitimacy of the parliamentary system at the time when those takings were rolling through. But in relation to dealing with corporate international capital, this business about takings is a really serious one, and it does need to be unbundled from trade, put over here, and dealt with on its merits on the basis of some fairly clear legal thinking, which is why I'm pleased that it's a lawyer who's running all this stuff, because these are legal questions. They're not for economists. Economists can't tell you what is a just taking. So that's what I was going to say.
Thank you, Jeff. Lots to think about there. We'll come back to that. And so, lastly, because she asked to be last, we've got Sanya Reid-Smith, who is from the Third World Network, but works right around the world on these agreements, and is a competitor to Jane for her knowledge of these agreements. So she's got a huge fund of knowledge there. And I'm very interested in what she has to say. Sanya, human rights are a vitally important protection for people, which, if effective, underpin their democratic rights, their rights at work, their standard of living, equity of treatment, privacy, and much else. They are particularly important in the face of powerful forces, including large corporations, and the policies they tend to support. How do you see the structure of the international treaties we were talking about being changed to give these rights some primacy?
Yeah, thank you, Bill, and thanks to the traditional owners of this land for welcoming us, and to all of you for coming, and to the organisers for including me. So I will look at what the trade agreements should look like to better protect human rights, because as we heard from Jeff, many of today's trade agreements like the tppa2018 are not just about exporting milk and importing computers. For example, only 6 out of the 30 chapters of the tppa2018 were about exporting stuff and importing laptops. The other 24 chapters were about restricting your regulatory space and your policy space, like making medicines more expensive, or the investor-state dispute settlement that many people have been talking about. And I think this hui is very timely and needed, because New Zealand is not only negotiating free trade agreements like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership right now, which is why I'm in Auckland, but also there are current negotiations at the World Trade Organization, and both these can harm human rights, the environment, labour rights, public services, and so on. So all of these, plus the investment treaties that New Zealand has some of, and the existing trade and investment agreements, all need to be rethought, including from a human rights lens, which is what I'll focus on. And I think it's also timely because we see some new governments who are more progressive coming into office, and they say, oh, we've fixed it. And they do a cosmetic change, and they change the name of the TPP to Comprehensive and Progressive, and they say, job done, all fixed, nothing to worry about, nothing to see here. I've put the word progressive in the name of the agreement. Or they have a gender chapter in some of these new trade agreements negotiated by Canada that doesn't actually address any of the problems that the trade agreement causes for women. It just says, we love women and let's have a committee, all fixed, all done. Women, you keep quiet, this is now good for you. So the question is, what would be a real serious change to these agreements to make them better? In my case, what I'm looking at here is for human rights. And I just wanted to briefly mention 4 issues. The first one is there have been a lot of critiques of the impact of these standard trade and investment agreements like the tppa2018 on human rights, including by 10 UN special rapporteurs on human rights, who said that these trade and investment agreements can harm human rights, including the right to food, water, health, housing, education, culture, labour rights, environment, and so on. And these UN human rights bodies have given detailed critiques of various provisions in these trade and investment agreements, including the investment provisions on expropriation that Jeff mentioned, fair and equitable treatment, repeated concerns about this investor-to-state dispute settlement, and the impacts on the environment or food security, access to affordable medicines, smoking reduction, and so on. And the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples actually said that the outdated belief of governments that they're in a position to guarantee security for investors via these agreements while ignoring the human rights of Indigenous peoples must be debunked. She was very clear about that. And these investment provisions have not been proven to attract foreign direct investment, which is the reason why most governments sign onto them, is because they think they'll get more FDI. So if it's not proven to bring FDI, then where are the benefits to outweigh the costs that you've been hearing about of agreeing to investor-state dispute settlement or the rest of the rules in the investment provisions? The UN Special Rapporteurs on Human Rights were also concerned about the stronger intellectual property on medicines that Lena mentioned in the health session, about UPOV 91, a treaty that can make seeds 4 times more expensive for farmers and facilitate biopiracy of Maori traditional knowledge. And they were concerned about the cost of textbooks, which can be worsened by the stronger intellectual property on copyright. But these are not the only provisions in these trade agreements that can harm human rights. You heard about the e-commerce provisions and the impacts they can have on privacy. Even the services rules in these trade agreements can undermine various human rights, and labour rights can be threatened by multiple chapters in these trade agreements currently being negotiated by New Zealand. But it's not just the UN who's raising these human rights concerns. You heard yesterday Dr. Slatter mentioned the letter by 221 women's groups rejecting the WTO's gender declaration because it's a Trojan horse for the new issues and it doesn't address the existing problems for women in the existing WTO rules. So the second issue I wanted to say was, if you're going to have these problematic provisions in trade and investment agreements, and they're problematic for the reasons we just went through, then you need to have a broad, effective, easy-to-use exception for human rights and the other issues that we've been talking about in this week. Because we heard in the health session this morning that trade negotiators are effectively trading away people's lives for more exports. That's it. You all have more expensive medicines and you die from preventable things like hepatitis C or cancer so that some other people in your country, a few of them, can export a bit more stuff. So people living with HIV/AIDS have long said, don't trade away our lives. This is something that is not negotiable in a trade agreement. There should not be provisions that harm the right to health and the right to life. So because human rights treaties are legally, the same status as a free trade agreement or a trade agreement, you would think, okay, they're equal, right? But in practice, these trade agreements and investment agreements are enforceable. You don't comply, you get sued at the International Tribunal, tariffs on your exports until you change your law to comply, even if you were doing it to comply with the Human Rights Treaty, and in the case of ISDS, of course, billions of dollars in damages. So the human rights treaties, the health treaties like the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, the environment treaties, the labour treaties, unenforceable. So if your government has to choose where there's a conflict between the trade agreement or complying with a human rights treaty or a labour treaty, which one do you think they're going to comply with, right? So the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples said that international investment agreements, for example, must have properly constructed exceptions for the right to regulate. And we see that the European Commission, the section responsible for the GDPR, the new privacy laws, has actually proposed in the last couple of months a pretty good exception for privacy that is subjective, and it's better to use than the standard self-cancelling WTO-style one, which is what's in the tppa2018. But that's only for privacy, not for any other human rights like health, indigenous rights, education, no. The good exception is only for privacy. So the third thing is, if you're going to negotiate these trade and investment agreements, then the negotiating process itself should be consistent with human rights. So again, the 10 UN Special Rapporteurs on various human rights said that they were concerned about the secret nature of negotiating these trade and investment agreements. And they recommended that all the negotiations should be done transparently with consultation and participation of stakeholders like unions and consumer groups and environment groups. They secondly recommended all the negotiating texts should be published so that civil society and parliamentarians can see what's in them, can give inputs. And this is actually doable. This is something that's already happening today. The EU publishes their proposals in their free trade agreement negotiations, including with New Zealand, and they're still able to conclude the negotiations. The same issues we've been discussing are negotiated at the World Trade Organization, the World Intellectual Property Organization, where again the proposals are public. And in WIPO, as a civil society, I can walk into the negotiations, sit there, listen to all the governments speak, put my hand up and speak after they've spoken, get all the negotiating texts. They can still conclude deals on the same issues as the free trade agreements, which somehow must be done in secret. And the third thing is, of course, the human rights impact assessments that people have mentioned. This has been recommended by the UN Special Rapporteurs on Human Rights to be done before and after, including for your existing trade agreements. And again, this is doable. The Thai government managed to do it for their US free trade agreement. If the Thai government can do it, why can't developed countries do it? Not to mention the health impact assessments and environmental impact assessments that others have talked about. So then lastly and briefly, we do need to figure out what to do about the existing trade and investment agreements, including those that New Zealand has signed on to, which are problematic for human rights and the other things we've been discussing here. And again, the 10 UN Special Rapporteurs on human rights have said we invite states or governments to revisit the treaties and ensure that they foster and don't hinder human rights. And some governments are withdrawing from treaties that are problematic, like the investment treaties. India is withdrawing, South Africa, Indonesia, Ecuador, and so on. Some fixes can be done multilaterally. So trying to make ISDS more transparent was done via UNCITRAL agreement. And the fourth option is some governments are replacing their old treaties with new, better ones. You could argue the new NAFTA is better in some areas, like it has no ISDS between Canada and the US, but obviously it was worse in some areas, like access to medicines.
Thank you very much. So I hope you're all filling out little bits of paper with your questions, but I'll start it off. Richard, you spoke about, on one hand, good, solid agreements that do, I took it to mean that do preserve consumer rights and enhance them. And on the other hand, that some of the implementation of them should be taken out of the agreements and should be done separately. Could you just fill that out a bit more? What would a good agreement, what would the content of agreement look like if it was good and solid and protecting consumer rights? And what are you referring to in terms of what should be out of those agreements?
We think it's just to be a trade agreement, you know, like people have mentioned that all the stuff that gets shoveled into this bucket, we call it trade, it's got nothing to do with trade, investment, intellectual property. So, and the regulatory stuff that happens on both sides of an agreement is massive. It's bigger than the agreement. That's how the reality of a trade agreement is expressed in a country, whether it's free or not, all the rest of it. And that's all behind closed doors. That's our biggest issue. The whole trade agreement's a secret, and the regulatory stuff is done by government officials. We don't know what it is or why, or we don't even know what the regulations always are. They're just slipped in. So we want an open, transparent process. I don't know what it is. We don't know what it is. A framework where regulators on both sides of the agreement can talk to each other outside of politicians and figure out the best way to make this work for the people on both sides of the agreement. And that process should be transparent to all. So we can all publicly look on a website and go, oh, there's going to be a regulation comes in now, we can only do this with a car or whatever it is. So public can kick back on it, that we're part of it. So we want a much more open democratic process around the regulations. And because there's too many regulations. Yeah.
Thank you. Chief, you don't shudder like that. You talked about how investment didn't have a place in these agreements. Do you have any thoughts on what we do about sort of international regulation of investment? Presumably it's still necessary in some form.
Yeah, you have to have some set of agreed rules. And so if the multilateral agreement on investment had actually been a discussion from the grassroots about how we want to run a world in which there is going to be investment flowing across borders, it would have had a very different outcome. What we got was a top-down imposition of the corporate agenda. And a vast popular movement said no. As soon as you got it unbundled and you had a straight-up choice, are we going to do this or not? The answer was no way. Okay? When you get it all bundled up with a lot of rhetoric about the benefits of trade, nobody knows quite how to stop it. You've got to get it unbundled, and then you've got to be open to the possibility that some international rules on managing investment is not a bad idea. Just do it right.
I mean, that raises the idea that maybe we should be moving more to multilateral agreements in specialised areas rather than increasing number of bilateral and plurilateral agreements that cover an enormous range of different things that get traded off against each other, and so no particular rights are ever guaranteed. Andrew, you talked about GDPR. Perhaps you could just spell out for people here what that stands for and just a little bit about it. But I mean, it seems to be a significant step forward in protecting privacy. And the question raised in my mind, and you raised it in the sense that we're just legislating for privacy in New Zealand and it's fit for 2015, but not for the future. What happens as things change? Is GDPR going to be fit for the future? And how would we develop it if it's actually the property of the EU and not kind of international property? Is that the right way to do these things, to rely on one, if you like, one jurisdiction's version of it? I mean, I bear in mind that the United States really doesn't have any proper rights in this area. It's kind of a commercial right rather than a human right. And so there's big tensions there. So if you could just talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, a lot of questions there. We'll start off with the GDPR, which is the General Data Protections Regulations, which was passed, well, it came into force from the European Union this year. And it basically required a whole bunch of things around consent and opting in to participating in certain services and whether or not you agree to give your data up to certain services. So everyone would have received a bunch of emails saying that they had to opt in or opt out of particular services a couple of months ago. There was a big scramble for everybody to get their ducks in a row. And it is probably seen as one of the more progressive sets of privacy legislation around the world right now, and everyone else is sort of taking a wait-and-see approach. So the privacy is an area where there is a pretty good international community, particularly around there's an International Association of Privacy Commissioners. So they all get together and talk about these sorts of issues and then go, okay, well, let's wait until they've tried this out and see what the adverse effects are. And then if it's good, we'll copy it. They are all trying to make things better generally. But there are definitely differing opinions about whether or not some regulations go too far. So GDPR, for example, I personally think that it's mostly good, but definitely a lot of people think that it goes too far, and they think that it's stifling innovation and so on and so forth. Depends on which side of the fence you sit on, I suppose. But I can see that in Canada, for example, is sort of saying that maybe the GDPR, they're not going to copy-paste the whole thing. So there is this concept of adequacy around captured inside the European privacy legislation that says that we will do trade, well, we will basically certify certain countries as being adequate under our standards, and if they're adequate, then you can do certain types of trade with them that you can't do with other countries. New Zealand currently has adequacy under, I think maybe 2012 was when we got it, and it was a big deal because it was like, yay, that's good for trade. But at the moment, Canada is considering just not doing that because they're saying that maybe adequacy is actually too high a bar for them, or European standards of adequacy might be too high a bar for them, given their expectations and requirements. So they're sort of saying, well, we'll still think about it, but maybe we won't try as hard to keep adequacy. Here in New Zealand, it appears that we're going, at the moment, if nothing changes, then we're going to keep trying to maintain that adequacy standard. Because we think, well, you can argue that it's because we think that privacy is important. You can also argue that it's because we want to maintain our trade relationships with Europe, depending on how cynical you are.
What about the United States?
The United States is a whole different thing.
under this?
Yeah, I mean, the companies themselves are sort of maintaining those relationships and meeting the standards because otherwise they lose the European market. But as a state, it's a mess. I don't think there's any comprehensive privacy legislation in the United States that sort of makes any sense at this stage. And they're going to do their own thing. They're unlikely to just copy carte blanche from Europe because then they'd be copying from the Europeans and the Americans can't have that. So yeah, I think they'll try to do their own thing. But American privacy legislation is a mess because we're lucky in New Zealand because we have principles-based privacy legislation, which means that we can take those same principles and apply them to a whole bunch of different circumstances. In America, there's a lot more specific things that say you can do this, you can't do that, and that just means that it all gets outdated really, really quickly. And they're constantly playing catch up and very much influenced by the powerful lobbyists who have a say in how those laws are being constructed.
Thank you. Sonia, we've got a few questions coming, but you spoke about, I sort of got two models out of what you were talking about in terms of protecting rights. One was that you beef up exceptions within the agreements. Another is that you raise the primacy, if you like, of the international rights agreements of various sorts. Can you just talk about the pros and cons of those two different approaches?
Yeah, so I think there's probably actually three. One would be do no harm, don't have the bad rules that cause such problems to human rights and arguably have no benefits or less benefits than the costs, like investor-state dispute settlement, for example, or stronger intellectual property on medicines when New Zealand is a net importer of intellectual property like Australia and most countries in the world. So one is do no harm, don't have the bad stuff. The next two options are kind of second best. If you're going to have these bad provisions in some way because somebody's insisting on them and you have to have a trade agreement with them because you have to export stuff, then to have better exceptions, and how you phrase that, Jane Kelsey has been working on kind of the best wording, and it's the security exception actually, which is what we say subjective. It's anything that the government deems appropriate or necessary to do, they can do for normally security, but you could also say human rights or environment or whatever. And that's the wording that's been used by the EU's DG Justice, who's responsible for the GDPR, in their privacy exception. And so you could break it down the way Russell did yesterday into, anything we do to comply with our human rights obligations under treaties, and then domestic, or you could just have a general one. There's some question in these trade agreements, if you say inconsistent with some other treaty, then it becomes an issue of have all the countries in the free trade agreement signed on to that human rights treaty, and it gets a bit messy. Yeah. Thank
you. And I've got two questions here, and I'm just trying to work out what they're saying. One is about the surveillance and harassment of activists by unethical businesses whose commercial interests are threatened by the activism. I'm not sure what the question is here, really, but I presume it is about the ability of whether perhaps you could frame that in terms of whether there should be rights that whether there should be duties that corporations should adhere to, as well as whether they have rights. Would Sonia, you're interested in?
I'll give it a try. I'm not sure if I understand what the question was getting at, but we see, for example, there was a famous ISDS case actually in Mexico where there was a Canadian mining company. It was a very unpopular mine. People were demonstrating against it. A Canadian mining company employee went to the demonstrator's house and shot him dead. The Mexican government said, oh, hang on, this is a problem. Let's put a temporary stop to the mining activities while we figure out what went on. And the Canadian mining company was going to sue under ISDS to say, pay me the lost profits I would have made during the time you've stopped my mine from operating, i.e. pay the murderer. And this is because the investor rights that we've been talking about, including in the TPP11, are absolute rights. The investor has the right to sue and get damages for their lost profits, no matter what laws they have broken, no matter if they are Chevron and polluting the Amazon rainforest in Ecuador, no matter if they're the Canadian mining company murdering demonstrators. They always have the right to sue, and they always have the absolute right to get full compensation for damages. There has been a pushback on this. So in 2016, Slovakia and Iran have a new investment treaty which says investors can only sue if they have complied with the domestic law of the host country. They haven't gone around murdering demonstrators. So they have to come in legally and they have to operate legally, they have to pay their taxes, otherwise they don't get the rights. So this is some of the new models that we see. If you're going to have these investment treaties, then at least the company should comply with domestic law. Otherwise, it's pay the polluter, pay the murderer, pay the lawbreaker, because their rights are absolute and they get a scot-free pass on all New Zealand, say, regulations and laws. It may also relate to the e-commerce chapter provisions, which is also about letting your data go out, as we heard. And we know from Edward Snowden that when our data is stored in the US government walks in, the NSA, and downloads Gmail, Yahoo, Dropbox, whoever else. And so if that is about activists, then their communications are also vulnerable. And so this is why some countries say we want to store certain sensitive data in our own countries. It depends again on who your government is, but yeah, that's one of the other ways to think about it.
Thanks. Did you have anything to say about that question on corporate duties, Jeff, as opposed to corporate rights?
Corporations need to be subject to the law of the land, and the law of the land should impose duties where appropriate. If it doesn't, change the law.
So are there, yeah. You got a question, Jane? No?
I wonder whether, Sanya, you could talk a little bit more about the UN Human Rights Committee binding treaty that's currently being negotiated. And Andrew, I'm really interested in why you think the new Privacy Act is so weak, and whether in the new negotiation we have with the EU may in fact consider that it is not adequate in light of the GDPR.
So there's two areas in which the privacy bill is probably a bit weak, and this is my opinion only. The first part is that it doesn't have some of the rights that are offered under the GDPR, so things like the right to be forgotten, essentially, and there are a bunch of other rights that aren't even included in either of those two pieces of legislation. So there are things like the right to, well, it's being discussed in the EU about the right to not be subject to algorithmic processing if you choose not to be, if you would prefer not to be subject to that. The right to retain control over particularly your biometric data, which is stuff that you can't change about your stuff. And the right to have explicit consent over the secondary trade of your data. So these are some of the more modern rights that are being discussed but aren't really in any of the legislation. And then the second part is around enforcement. So the new privacy bill basically has, we currently have almost no enforcement. The new privacy bill/act will have slightly more than almost no enforcement. The penalties are all really low. The Office of the Privacy Commissioner has a little bit more power, but really not enough. This can be contrasted to the GDPR, which has the ability to levy penalties that are up to, I think it's like 4% of global revenues, which really makes companies wake up when they realize that that's a large amount of money for a Google or a Facebook. And so I think that's a sign that actually we could be trying to do a lot more with our bill here in New Zealand. To really send the message that this is serious and that we actually do care about this. In terms of whether or not our bill will become an issue in terms of maintaining adequacy with the European Union, that may be an issue, but I think that the current strategy is that we will keep trying to update our legislation. So that current aim is to maintain adequacy, and so we will be regularly reviewed on a not annual but semi-annual basis, I think it seems like we're going to try and maintain our standards to match the European Union. The adequacy standards don't actually require that as a state we have exactly the same requirements as the GDPR. There are some things that we're allowed to not do. It's the companies that have to comply with the GDPR. So adequacy is a slightly different set of standards to what the GDPR holds companies to.
I know it's lunchtime, I don't want to stop you, but just briefly on what Jane was raising, there are negotiations on a UN binding treaty to make companies liable for human rights violations. So it would be good if the New Zealand government could support that. The question is, again, how enforceable will that be compared to a trade or an investment treaty? So if it's just like another human rights treaty, which is unenforceable, you don't comply, nothing happens to you, then if governments face a choice between complying with that and complying with a trade or investment agreement, then they'll still go for the trade or investment agreement.
Well, I think we're out of time, so I think we need to finish there.
Can I just add one quick thing? I just wanted to add one quick thing. So as an engineer, I'm in an audience here that is probably mostly not my normal audience or my normal field, and I'm probably not your normal target. I'd really like to encourage you to talk to the people who are making the technology if you're worried about the impacts of technology. And what I mean by that is the actual developers, not the managers, not the owners, but the people who are actually making the technology, because they do actually have a lot of power. And in the same way that most of you probably will believe in workers' rights, the same does exist in technology companies. So this year, earlier this year, a bunch of Google employees were pretty upset that Google was agreeing to Department of Defense contracts, and they managed to shut it down. So Google stopped those contracts back due to their employee backlash. So please don't just break down the silos, right? Please break down the silos, and make sure that if you're worried about the impacts of technology, talk to people who are making it.
There are a couple of questions from the audience there, but I think it's probably time for people to have lunch, and maybe they can come up and ask some of the panel their questions. So once again, can I ask you to thank the 4 participants in the panel? And we'll start, we need to be back when? Only have a half-hour lunch. So does that mean 1:05, Jane?
For those who weren't here yesterday, in the glass building that Alex works in next door, there's a cafe. A little bit further on at the Student Union, there's various other cafes that are open, but it would be really good if you could kind of procure it and maybe bring it back around here so that we don't have to go trying to find people when we're about to start on the next session. Thank you. Oh, sorry, so half an hour from now is about 5 past.